Today we're going to show you how to solder on a wiring harness adapter to a regular car stereo power cable, speaker cable, so you can put it in your vehicle and have it be reliable. I'm going to start out by showing you what not to do. This week I had 3 installations, well actually I should say reinstallations. People brought me their vehicles, they were having intermittent problems, hum noises, all kinds of issues, and upon inspection I saw that there were substandard installations performed, and I'm going to show you some of the what I like to call hack work that was performed. These people went to install shops, supposedly professionals, paid good money, and now they're at me getting it fixed and done correctly. Well, basically what we have here is somebody who used these crimp style wire nuts. You just kind of twist the wire together, put this wire nut on and crimp it down with a crimp tool. You know, it works, but still not the best way to do it. Here's another one that it looks like a pretty good wire fire mess here. We got a lot of black tape. We have solderless connections that are crimped down. Solderless connections that the guy didn't have enough confidence in, that I guess he had to decide to black tape them up. And here's just a total black tape mess. I mean, it's gooky, it's sticky. It actually was in the car working for a while, but he has all kinds of intermittent connections, so I didn't even bother to look under there. I'm going to assume there's solderless connections, or you just twisted the wires and taped them together. None of these are acceptable ways of doing it. We're going to do it so it's done. It's going to last for years, probably longer than your car, and we'll see what we can show you. The tools required today to perform this job, to correctly wire up our car stereo, will be diagonal cutters, wire strippers, a heat gun, soldering iron, solder paste, of course the wiring harness that came with the car stereo that will be installed, and our adapter harness. We're going to be installing this in a Chevrolet, so this is a GM type harness. It will be mated to the harness that came with the car stereo. We are going to splice, solder, and heat shrink tube each wire. It should be a good, strong, long-lasting installation. Okay, let's get started with identifying the wires that are on the harness. I'm going to start with black. These are all pretty universal. You'll find that most car audio equipment that's been made in the last decade or so has gone to a pretty common color code. They're not always the same, so you should always double check, but let's go through this one here, and it's one of the most common ones. So black is always ground pretty much. Where are you going to connect this to? Well, you can connect it to the adapter harness. I personally like to have a dedicated ground wire going back to the battery, so if you're in a situation where you can do that, I would do both. It never hurts. You have to realize that a lot of stuff goes to chassis ground, and when automobiles are manufactured, all the parts are painted and then assembled. So a lot of interconnectivity between fenders, doors, chassis parts, engines, transmissions, things like that. Everything's painted, so it's not all a good solid ground. So the best way is to go back, have a dedicated ground wire right to your battery lead. The next one is yellow, battery power. This is a full-time power. We need to have this for 2 reasons. First of all, it's a heavier wire because it has to power the internal amplifier. But another thing is it remembers all your presets, memories, your clock time, and things like that. If you don't have this, every time you turn the vehicle on, it'll be like the car stereo was just installed. There will be no presets, no clock set, things like that. So this has to go back to the battery. It's fused. And whenever you run something back to the battery, you should also have a fuse very close to the battery also. You may be able to find a full-time power wire in the fuse box of the vehicle. Again, depending on the vehicle it's in, it might be easier to just go right back to the battery. Again, I prefer that. The next one is our red wire, and this is our switched power wire. This comes on with the key, or the accessory position of the vehicle. The reason we have this is so when you decide to stop driving, park in the driveway, pull the key out, the car stereo goes off, whether you turn the power off or not. So this is our switched lead that turns the unit on and off with the key. Orange wire. This is illumination. This is an important wire. It'll work without it. A lot of people neglect to hook it up. But basically what it does is when you're driving at night, you have your lights on. The dash normally dims a little bit so it doesn't look blaring into your eyes. It's not very bright. Well, it'll do the same thing to the display to your car audio device, your car stereo. So if this is wired, when you turn your lights on at night, it will slightly dim this display so it doesn't look overbearingly bright. As far as speaker connections, typically these are pretty standard too. Your gray connections, you'll have a solid gray lead and a gray lead with a black stripe. The same thing will go for white, violet, and green. Well, your gray is your front right speakers, your white would be your front left speakers, your green This pair here would be your rear left speakers, and your purple or violet would be your rear right speakers. Now, a lot of people think you can just hook speakers up anyway. It doesn't matter with plus and minus. And that's true. The speakers will make sound. It will not hurt anything. The problem is if you have your left speaker hooked up correctly, the plus and minus going to the right area, and then you have your other speaker hooked up backwards, when one speaker cone is pushing, the other speaker cone will be pulling. So the speakers are what we call out of phase, and this will actually cause a reduction in sound, especially with bass. So it is important for best sound quality to have the polarity to your speakers correct. In this situation, I am not using the internal power amplifier for the car. We're adding a subwoofer amplifier and an amplifier for the front, rear, and front, left, right, and front, rear, and left speakers. So basically, all the speaker wires are not going to get utilized. You have a choice. I personally like to keep things clean and neat, so I'm actually going to cut these right off. I don't need them. I'm not going to need them for what we're doing. We're going to feed RCA jacks out, low-level audio, to the input of amplifiers, and the amplifiers are going to do the work. So I'm actually going to double-check my wiring here. I'm going to take my gray leads, my green leads, my purple leads, and my white leads. I am going to take the time. I'm actually going to just cut them, snip them right off. That'll neaten up my harness a little bit because, like I said, a lot of this other stuff is all I'm going to need required. I am going to need my red lead. I am going to need my yellow lead. Of course, we need ground. The remote line. This blue with the white stripe is my remote line. When the car stereo comes on, this sends 12 volts out to power accessory devices, crossover networks, power amplifiers, and things like that. So they come on with this. So obviously I'm going to need this. This will be a separate wire that runs out of the back, and it will go to my amplifiers and my crossover network. Here's another blue wire. A lot of people don't understand what this is. This is the power antenna lead. If your automobile has a power antenna, an antenna that comes up and out of the fender when the vehicle's on, you need a power antenna lead. Some people will just hook it to the remote line, which is fine. It will work. As soon as you put the key in, turn it, the power antenna goes up. When you have a radio that actually has a separate power antenna lead, the only time this goes hot to put the power antenna up is when you turn on the AM or FM mode of the radio. If you're listening to a CD, an MP3, or another audio source, the power antenna goes down. So the only time the antenna goes up is when the radio is engaged. So if you have a power antenna, you definitely want to wire it to this blue lead here. Okay, here's my GM connector that's going to plug in to the stock factory harness, and all the colors are pretty much the same. White, gray, green, and violet or purple are my speaker connections. Again, in this system, I'm not using any speakers, so I'm actually cutting these guys right off. I don't need them, so I'm going to get rid of them. Get them out of the way. I don't have to have a big mess under my dashboard. I will be connecting ground. I will be using a remote lead. I will be using my illumination, I will be using my switched power, and I will be using my full-time power. So we're going to strip these wires. We're going to splice them onto my harness. So I'm going to take the time to strip each wire on both harnesses. Okay, now that all the wires on my harnesses are stripped, I want to take a few minutes and I want to twist the stranded copper wire that's on each harness, because what we're going to do is we're going to tin each one of these wires with solder. A couple of safety things: do not forget to wear your safety glasses when soldering. Don't forget, you will be handling lead. Solder is an alloy of lead and tin. Lead is a hazardous material. The last thing you want to do is get it in your mouth. So don't pick your teeth with the solder. Don't eat the solder. I promise it doesn't taste good. When you're done, wash your hands, because you'll have a residue of solder on there, and the last thing you want to do is grab a hoagie or a sandwich and eat it, and next thing you know, you ate a little tiny bit of lead. Probably won't hurt you, but let's be safe. What I'm going to do is, let's take this harness first. I'm going to tin the 4 wires. Remember, I cut off all my speaker wires nice and short because we're going to use the RCA connectors. We're going to just use basically our power wires, our illumination wire, so we can fire up the car stereo. The audio will come out the RCAs and feed separate amplifiers. What I want to do is I want to take my solder. I'm going to dip it in some flux or soldering paste. Make sure you're using the correct flux. You don't want to use plumber's flux, totally different stuff than for electronic soldering. I'm going to heat my copper wire and flow some solder through it. This is called tinning. There's some other ways of doing it. If you're in manufacturing, you might have a solder pot where you have a molten little pot of solder, and you can actually dip the wires in flux and then dip them in there. It's a faster, more efficient way. But if you're not doing anything high volume, this is a quick and easy way to do it. Don't forget to periodically clean your soldering iron tip to make sure your work is clean. And as you can see, we have 4 nice tinned wires there. We're going to take the time and do the same thing to the other harness. Now, I want to talk a little bit about what we're doing. We are soldering here, and when you're soldering, we're kind of making our stranded wire solid. And I've heard the argument from some installers that when you make a wire solid, it's a possibility that, you know, it can fatigue. Think of a coat hanger. If you take a coat hanger and bend it back and forth, you feel it get a little bit of warmth to it. The metal fatigues and then it breaks really quick. So their argument, and it's a valid one, is that when you're driving down the road, the wiring harness is vibrating, and over time, months, years, decades, however long it takes, the solid wire where I'm soldering will fatigue and possibly cause it to crack and break. Well, we're going to use heat shrink tubing, which will actually help support the wire, kind of act like a strain relief and prevent that from occurring. I really think it's more of an argument for them because they're not good solderers and they don't want to take the time to do it right. Not slamming too many installers out there, but so many people use solderless terminals and crimps, and they have their reason. I've seen way more problems with dissimilar metals. The actual solderless terminals start to corrode with the copper. I find that this way keeps things from corroding. It seems to be much more reliable. Okay, the next thing is, you know, I have multiple wires here. I have to save this blue wire from my remote line, so this is not going to get hooked up at the moment. My orange, red, black, and yellow are going to get joined. First thing, don't forget, slide your heat shrink tubing on, because if you solder it first, you have no way of getting your heat shrink tubing back on there. So I'm going to put red on my red and orange wire. We're going to take a piece of red also for my yellow wire. Slide that guy on there, and I'm going to use green for ground just because I didn't have any black heat shrink tubing laying around. I'm going to set this other heat shrink tubing aside for now. And what I want to do is I'm going to take my soldering iron, I'm going to take my wires, I'm actually going to hold them together, hit them with the iron until they melt together. Sometimes you might want to add a little solder while you're doing this. I find that when the solder is wet and hot, it does seem to join a whole lot better. If you're not really proficient at this, you might want to have a friend help. Wait for it to dry, and as you can see, I have a good tight connection. I'm now going to slide my heat shrink tubing over to where my connection is in the middle. I'm going to grab my heat gun. Don't burn yourself. And I ended up with a nice, strong, shrunk up heat shrink connection. Now, doesn't that look a whole lot better than that black tape, those crappy solderless connections and things like that? Much better. Let's do another one, and then I'll finish up my harness. I'm going to do the same thing for the red connection here. I'm going to tin it just a little bit more, get my solder wet, and I'm going to splice these guys together. This is probably the hardest part of the job. Like I said, sometimes it helps to have a friend or coworker have a steady hand. There we go. We're connected up. Again, I'm going to slide my heat shrink tubing over my bare connection. Take my heat gun. And I'm going to continue to do this for all of my connections. If you were doing it with your speaker connections, you'd have quite a few connections to do, but you end up with a much nicer, neater, more reliable job. The heat shrink tubing supports the solid solder, which should stop it from metal fatiguing, and you end up with a good, strong, reliable connection that should last for years. Okay, we now have our wiring harness all put together, everything nice and neatly heat shrunk. There's our inline fuse. Here's the connection that goes back to the Alpine. And I took a moment and got about 15 or 20 feet of blue wire, spliced it onto my blue remote lead, because this will be run back to the back of the vehicle where the amplifiers are going to be placed. What I'm going to do next is just take a moment. I'm going to kind of orient my wires nice and neat, and I'm going to put a zip tie or two on. Snip that guy off. I'm going to do the same thing here. And that look a lot better than what we started out with. That big wire tied mess or electrical taped mess. Let me get this out of the way. And I'm going to take one more step. I'm going to get some split loom tubing. You can buy this at Pep Boys or Advanced Auto Parts, different places like that. And you know, they use this under the hood of a lot of vehicles, and it does look a lot more professional. And I'm going to take a minute or so and get this all my wires in there. Again, looks a lot nicer, neater. I'm also going to zip tie that just so it doesn't come undone. You can kind of torque down on that pretty good, make it nice and strong on there. That didn't work, my zip tie broke. Let's try this again. Snip. Let's try this one over here. I'm going to cut one more small short piece for here. Here's our completed wiring harness. As you can see, it looks a whole lot better than what we started with. Now we're going to go out to the vehicle, install the stereo, plug it in, and see what happens.